So first on the list for artists, or DJs, I guess in this case, is a DJ. It is Nat D Williams. And Nat D Williams he's from Memphis. He was also known as the Voice of Memphis. And he was, and one thing I will note that is interesting is that a lot of the artists / DJs that we had talked about up to this point, so many of them, we focus a lot on the migration, the Great Migration, and the Second Great Migration. So now, as you kind of seen, this is a process that has been taking place for a while now, and you can see that in Nat D Williams' case specifically, he was born in Memphis, which is obviously a city, and so many of the previous artists, most of the artists, I think T-Bone Walker was born, I think he was born outside of the city, and I think he moved to Dallas. So many of the artists were born, like on as sharecroppers. Their parents were sharecroppers, or they're born onto plantations in rural areas. And now you will see more artists who are just born in the city. And I think something just to pay attention to is how that kind of shapes their trajectory and kind of the influences that they have, being born right into a city center. And then of course, these are times where African American communities were having a tough time, as many Black communities and cities still are. But at the same time, it was a time where there was a lot of opportunity and a lot of families were thriving. And that was the case with Nat D Williams and his family, living in Memphis, specifically the Beale Street area, which was a thriving Black community at the time. And so so his parents were pretty successful, and that was kind of successful in terms of city life, and that kind of, I think, set him up a little bit better in a lot of ways than some of the previous individuals on our timeline. It's not a universal statement. There were definitely other individuals, I guess, speaking specifically about W.C. Handy and Louis Jordan. But I think, it's somewhat undeniable that if you come up in the city, and you have some success, or your parents have some success, that, just because of the opportunities that are already present in the city, you get a good opportunity to, kind of take a different trajectory than some other people who might, have moved to the city in their adult life, and kind of what they had to do in their trajectory. Once again, not a universal statement. Just because you're born in the city doesn't, mean you necessarily have a leg up, as we've talked about, and as we will talk about. There's a lot of struggle in the city as well, but just a different atmosphere, a different starting point. But in Nat D Williams' case, he went to Columbia University, and then he went to Northwestern, I think for his graduate degree. He was working as a editor and journalist after school. He specifically worked for the Memphis World, which was a publication in 1931. And, with his educational background and just his natural creativity and way of looking things, he was really able to kind of hone his craft and mix politics with humor and kind of shape that. And that kind of set him up really well to become a DJ. And, as we kind of talked about previously, newspapers and radio, as it was for everybody at the time, those were the primary mediums. But for the Black community specifically, now, there were ways to really directly connect with community in ways that just were not possible before. Especially in urban centers, if you don't live in a city, it's hard to, even for newspapers to distribute, to mass distribute something to the community. Radio kind of changes that. But in the case for Nat D Williams working at the Memphis World, he definitely took advantage of being able to, kind of build up his reputation and platform as a writer first, working in the Beale Street, Memphis area. And he also started to work as an MC. He MC'd at the Palace Theater, and that's where he was able to hone those skills as well as a DJ. So in Memphis there was a radio station called WDIA, and they had just started, and they were struggling to really break into they were struggling to have any success. They started playing country and western music, and that wasn't really working out. And so they, kind of, looking around them and realizing and seeing, the rising popularity of, the black community, the black radio market. We talked about Al Benson last episode in Chicago, and he had a lot of success. And seeing that, they wanted to try to break into the black radio market, and so they hired Nat D Williams, and they decided to switch their primary music to R&B. And of course, as we just talked about, R&B was an all-encompassing music for black music at the time, or R&B was an all-encompassing term for black music at the time. Which was really just, would have just been mostly what was either jump blues, R&B, or blues, and gospel. And Nat D Williams became the first black DJ in Memphis, and I believe he was the first black DJ below, of the South, essentially, in reference to the Mason-Dixon line, which is basically, the South. So he started out there with an evening program. One note is that we'll talk about later, but B.B. King also worked as a DJ at WDIA, and his success, Nat D Williams' success, led them to hire other black DJs, and they became the first all-black DJ radio station at the time. It wasn't, well, we'll talk about that later, the first black-owned radio station, but they were the first all-black DJ radio station. That was in 1949. So Nat D Williams, he caused a little bit of controversy just because, as we discussed, he had formal education in journalism, so he was pretty well versed as far as pulling politics and integrating that to his work as a DJ and infusing humor. He's a very popular DJ. And because of that, when he would talk about, various political and social issues, it caused a little bit of a stir, just because they were not necessarily, the popular mainstream areas of discussion, especially being in the South in Memphis. There was definitely a lot more racial tension. So there was, he got hate calls and threats, different retaliation, and some of it was around the music that he was playing. A lot of music for the time, R&B music for the time, was seen as having vulgar and just inappropriate, sexualized, just content that was frowned upon by many people. And so a lot of it was that, and some of it was just the social issues he talked about. He also talked a lot about African American history, just going over some of the recent history and some of the pioneers, and the evolution of black culture up until that point. And he talked about the news, different social topics, as I mentioned. He had a program that was called Brown America Speaks, in which he talked about the civil rights movement, talked about police brutality, and other political issues, and that caused controversy. I think the main controversy was around the music. Certainly talking about the civil rights movement, police brutality, was definitely something that was, a little bit more of a progressive stance and not appreciated by as many people. But I think the music was something that people specifically, because it was something that permeated, just American culture in general, and a lot of people saw it as a threat, just because of the things I said before, as far as some of the content of the song, which, once again, as I mentioned before, if you listen to the songs, it seems very mild, but I think it, kind of relates it to some of the hip hop or rap music, of today, as far as, some of the controversy that has surrounded that over the evolution of hip hop. Can go back to blues, as we talked about before, and similar controversy comes up as far as content. So it's just a recurring theme as new genres within black music come out. It's usually met with some form of controversy. And in Memphis, specifically in response to Nat D Williams and WDIA, there was a point where actually police broke into black-owned businesses and were destroying records that, were by the artists that were being played on the radio. Records by the same music by various artists who would have been played on the radio, just because, as I said, there was a concern of, this permeating culture, and then specifically black-owned businesses. Because there are businesses, there was, there was a little bit more gray area as far as what actions you could take to, break into a business versus breaking into homes. And I think black-owned businesses, of course, were more symbolic, and they were, symbols of black progress in general, and it was assumed that, somebody who was a black business owner in a lot of cases is kind of within this whole larger movement of, pushing for social and civil rights, and moving up, in America, moving up economically. So that was a continued thing. But overall, for Nat D Williams, he was well liked, very popular, and as far as the radio broadcast.